Finally, the road brought them to the house. Kate and Tom drove slowly up to a massive iron gate surrounded by overgrown trees and bushes that seemed to have been abandoned for a long time. The shabby, weed-covered lot surrounded a dilapidated two-story house that once, perhaps, looked majestic, but now caused a slight trepidation. The weak light was already beginning to fade. The sun was hiding behind the horizon, leaving behind only lilac and threatening purple shades. "So, what do you think of it?" Tom asked reservedly, examining the building. Kate smiled nervously. The house they had rented on a casual recommendation from a friend promised to be something unusual and mysterious. But the reality seemed a little different from what they expected. Tom got out first, helping Kate out of the car. Silence surrounded them, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. They opened the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The first thing they noticed was the strange smell of old furniture and damp walls. But despite the neglect, the house looked lived in. In the hall, they noticed a dusty closet, a massive chair, and an old carpet that seemed to have been there for ages. Footsteps echoed in the emptiness. "Do you think anyone else was here before us?" Kate tried to speak calmly, but her voice was treacherous. Tom looked around, feeling an inexplicable heaviness in the air. They began to examine the rooms. Most of the furniture was covered with sheets, and in one of the rooms they found an antique mirrored cabinet, as if from another century, standing in the center. "Wealthy people must have lived here," Tom said, sliding his fingers along the carved ornament. Every object in the house seemed to be a silent witness to past eras, and Kate soon felt a growing sense of anxiety. They walked a little further and came out into the backyard, where they found the remains of an old gazebo, leaning and covered in wild grapes. It reminded them of something abandoned and long forgotten, but at the same time strangely attractive. "You know, this house is really strange," Kate admitted, feeling a tremor in her voice. "It feels like someone is watching us." Tom smiled faintly, as if brushing off her fears, but he himself felt the same strange chill. He was about to say something encouraging to her, but suddenly fell silent, hearing a rustling sound coming from the depths of the garden. A rustling sound, as if someone was slowly moving through dry leaves. A figure flashed in the shadow of an old tree. Tom froze in place, peering into the shadow where the figure had flashed. His heart began to beat faster, but he decided to calm himself. "Maybe it's just my imagination." However, the anxiety did not go away. Kate noticed that Tom was looking somewhere over her shoulder and turned around. She, too, saw a faint movement in the trees. It could have been anything: a rabbit, a raccoon, even a branch touched by the wind. But the feeling that someone was watching them became almost unbearable. "Tom," she whispered, "should we go back inside? There's something wrong here." Tom nodded, and they, having cast one last glance at the strange shadow, returned to the house. They slammed the door behind them, trying to shut out the ominous atmosphere of the garden. Tom turned on the light in the hallway. The lamp flickered, as if capricious, but soon lit up, illuminating them with a barely noticeable yellow light. It seemed safer inside, but the tension did not go away. Tom suggested that Kate examine the house more closely and perhaps find traces of recent residents or those who could explain the strange phenomena. Kate reluctantly agreed, although she wanted to just leave and not come back. They began their inspection, climbing the ancient wooden stairs to the second floor. The stairs creaked under their steps, as if trying to warn them of something. There were several doors at the top, all locked. One of them stood out massive, with a heavy brass handle covered with a green coating. Tom carefully pressed it, and the door opened with a dull creak. The room was dimly lit, despite the window through which the weak rays of the setting sun penetrated. Inside there were antique things: an armchair with faded upholstery, a desk covered in a layer of dust, and a strange chest against the wall. Everything looked as if no one had been here for a long time. Kate walked over to the chest and carefully pulled the lid. Inside was a package, old and stained. She carefully unfolded it and saw yellowed pages covered in cramped handwriting. "It's a diary," she whispered, looking at Tom in surprise. Tom became interested and sat down next to her, examining the pages. The text was written in French, but Kate, who knew a little of the language, began to translate it out loud. May 1st, 1892. Horrible sounds at night. I'm afraid that one day they will get me. These words made them both fall silent. The feeling that their presence in the house was unwelcome was growing stronger. Kate continued reading. May 4th, 1892. I hide in my room and pray that they don't find me. The master said it was just old rumors, but I heard their voice. Kate stopped reading and they both perked up, as if they had heard something. Suddenly, the lamp in the room began to flicker and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and only the weak light of the moon penetrated through the windows. Tom sighed and turned on the flashlight on his phone, illuminating the room. In the darkness, the walls seemed to come alive, the shadows lengthened, and a quiet whisper was heard in their heads, as if from nowhere. Kate felt something pulling her back to the window. She came closer and looked outside, and again she noticed a figure standing under an old tree in the garden. This time its silhouette was clearer. It was a person. The figure was looking straight at her, not moving. The face was impossible to see in the darkness, but Kate knew she could see them. Kate turned around slowly, almost dropping her phone. Tom came up to her and looked out the window too, but the figure was gone. All that was left was silence and the ominous rustling of the tree branches. Perhaps we have become victims of our own fears, Tom tried to reassure her. Old houses have their own atmosphere. Kate tried to agree, but her heart was constricted with anxiety. After sunset, the house became silent. As darkness fell, strange and frightening things began to happen within its walls. Kate felt something sinister awakening here every night. In the second week of their stay, the strangeness began to take on a tangible form. Lamps flickered for no apparent reason, clicking as if someone was silently turning a switch on and off. Rooms that had recently seemed spacious now felt closed in, as if the walls themselves were narrowing and pressing in on them. One night, when Kate was awakened by a faint sound coming from the hallway, she did not immediately understand what it was. A barely audible whisper, as if someone was talking right behind the bedroom door, made her shrink in fear. She tensed, listening into the silence. Gradually, the whispers grew louder, the words became intelligible, although they were spoken so quietly that they seemed to dissolve into the air. The whisper did not belong to Tom or to any of the familiar voices. A few long minutes passed before the sound ceased, and Kate decided to turn to the window. Her attention was drawn to a movement behind the glass, a faint reflection in the night. It seemed as if someone was standing outside, close to the house, almost pressed against the window. Kate recoiled, holding her breath, but she could not look away. A pale shadow was visible outside the window, an elongated figure, with indistinct outlines, as if dissolved in the night air. Kate felt her heart squeeze with horror. She heard her name, spoken slowly, as if with caution, a growing echo. Kate. Unable to bear this nightmare any longer, she went to wake Tom. His sleep was heavy and deep, and only after the third shake on the shoulder did he finally open his eyes. "Tom, there's someone here," she breathed, her voice shaking with difficulty. "Outside the window, and I heard someone calling my name." Tom, dimly aware of what was happening, simply stared at her for a moment, trying to focus. Finally, he exhaled. "Kate, you're imagining things. It's just an old house, and yes, it may make strange noises, but—" "No," she interrupted, looking at him with despair. "They're not just noises, Tom. They're calling me, saying my name, you understand? I saw a shadow outside the window. We have to leave, please." Tom sighed heavily and rubbed his face. He seemed less irritated than exhausted by this repetitive conversation. "Kate," he said softly, "it could just be your imagination. You're so worked up about this whole house thing, but if you just relax, it'll go away. You have no proof that this isn't just an accident or your dreams." Kate looked down, clenching her hands. The night seemed to be closing in on her, and this house no longer felt safe. For several nights after the ominous whispers, Kate became increasingly troubled and unable to shake off her anxiety. Tom noticed that she barely slept, constantly listening to the silence and looking exhausted. He attributed it to lack of sleep and overexertion, but the house itself seemed to become more alien and gloomy. The shadows began to seem deeper, and the sounds even more ominous. One evening, while Tom was sitting in the living room, Kate returned to the bedroom, hoping that this night would bring her at least some peace. She had barely closed the door when she heard a faint rustling coming from the wall behind the bed. Kate froze. The sound resembled a faint scratching, as if someone or something was scratching from that side. She quietly approached the wall, listening. The sounds grew louder, turning into a whisper, indistinct and distant, as if someone were whispering a prayer or a spell to themselves. "Who are you?" she whispered, not realizing that she was speaking out loud. A second later, the scratching stopped, and an eerie tension hung in the silence. It seemed as if something behind the wall was waiting for her answer. Suddenly, unexpectedly for herself, Kate heard a quiet voice whispering her name so close, as if the invisible interlocutor was just behind a thin layer of plasterboard. The next morning, without waiting for Tom, Kate began to examine the walls in search of traces or signs that could explain the strange sounds. She found vague symbols on one of the walls of the bedroom, drawn with something dark, as if written by a trembling hand. These signs, as if mockingly immersed in shadow, became especially noticeable in the dim light. Kate turned pale, her mind racing with thoughts of ghosts, ancient spirits, and curses that could languish in this house. When Tom returned from the street, she made him come over and showed him the graffiti. Tom looked at the walls, but only sighed tiredly. "Kate, these are probably just old graffiti or remnants of old decor. There's nothing mystical here." But Kate couldn't calm down so easily. That night, she had a particularly hard time falling asleep. Lying in bed, she heard a quiet sound coming from the same wall again. This time it was louder and sounded like an inhuman roar, filled with pain and despair. The shadows on the wall swayed, as if someone was really hiding behind it. Several days had passed since Kate had discovered the strange symbols on the walls. She began to avoid the bedroom and almost never entered the rooms where these ominous signs were especially noticeable. Every day her anxiety grew, and with each nightly whisper her world became more and more unrecognizable. There was no peace or safety in the house anymore, and the nights became endless. Kate tried to talk to Tom, but his reaction was always the same. He did not believe in the supernatural, and he took her fears for ordinary fatigue. He convinced her that all these sounds and whispers were a figment of her imagination, or perhaps the result of old, poorly insulated walls. "Do you feel how the house is changing?" Kate asked one night while Tom was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. "Everything has become different. Dark. We can't stay here." Tom put the newspaper down and looked at her with tired eyes. "Kate, you see what's happening. You're tired, and your nervousness is making all these little sounds worse. We live in an old house, and yes, old houses can creak and rustle, but that doesn't mean there's anything evil here. It's all just a figment of the imagination." Kate was silent. Her heart was clenched with fear, and despite Tom's words, there was a growing feeling inside her that they were both playing a dangerous game, not realizing that there was much more at stake than just their comfort. The night was falling deeper and deeper, and as soon as the lights went out, the house began to come alive in its own way. The lamps grew dim, and the floors began to make terrible sounds. It all seemed unnatural, as if the house itself was fighting those who dared to live in it. One of those nights, when Kate was lying in her bed, absolutely unable to sleep, she heard something completely new. It wasn't a scratching, whispering, or creaking sound. It was a loud, heavy thumping. At first she thought it might be an animal trying to get into the house, but the sound came again. Kate sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from all directions, as if the house itself had become alive and was trying to tell her something. Tom, tired of her constant nighttime awakenings and fear, reacted to this with even greater irritation. "I can't do this anymore," he said, shaking his head. "We're leaving. We can't continue to live in this place." But his words didn't bring Kate any peace. On the contrary, she realized that she couldn't leave. The house knew her fears, knew her weaknesses, and now it wouldn't let her go so easily. At that moment, she realized that in order to get out, she had to face what the house was hiding. and something inside her told her that this house would never end until it swallowed them both. Later that night, Kate woke to a sudden silence. At first, she thought it was all just a dream, but then she noticed how her body was covered with cold. This was not an ordinary cold. It penetrated to her bones, like an icy hand, stopping her breath. Unable to rise, she turned her head to look in the darkness for Tom. But his bed was empty. She jumped up, her eyes searching the room in a panic. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the window, and her heart sank. Through the glass, she saw the silhouette of Tom standing on the balcony. He was motionless, like a statue, but his eyes, they were empty. "Tom," she screamed, but his eyes remained cold and lifeless. Kate felt with horror that something terrible had happened to her husband. She ran to the door, but it was locked. Panic washed over her and she pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, in the stillness of the night, a voice spoke, a familiar, ominous whisper that had once spoken her name. "It doesn't matter," the voice said. "It's all been decided." With tears in her eyes, Kate realized she had a choice to make. Her life was on the line, and whatever she decided, it would not be a simple battle for salvation, but a step into the unknown, into a place where the boundaries of reality and nightmares were erased.